So, we would like to welcome up Miss Teri Hill, who will be speaking about influencing generations from ties to tattoos.
Ooh, okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, one and all. Question for you. When's the last time either one of you felt the pain of rejection or not being accepted for your views, your attitudes, your behaviors, or even your appearance? Think about that for a moment. We live in a unique time where we have 4 distinct generations. There you go. 4 distinct generations in the workforce. Thank you. Do I need this? All right, thank you very much. We have 4 distinct generations in the workforce. I'm sorry, I'm looking at slides that aren't mine. We live in a time where we have 4 distinct generations in the workforce. That means we have 4 very different attitudes, habits, behaviors, methods of communicating, and work ethics. All of us feel the sting of bias and rejection every day with those differences of opinions all around us. I remember feeling that early on in life. I was born with a curvature in my spine, and I was knock-kneed and pigeon-toed, which meant that I walked around like this. I was scholarly, so I'd carry a book so I could feel somewhat accepted in reality, and it was really okay when I was at a private Catholic school in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But at age 8, my family moved to the wilds of New Mexico, where I went to a public school that was 60% Spanish-speaking. Now, not only did I feel rejected, but I also couldn't communicate. How many of you have been to New Mexico? It's sunny and beautiful 362 days a year, which is lovely, except for that people spend time in the sun. And what was rewarded was not scholarly pious. What was rewarded was your activity and how good you were in sports. I remember spending 2 hours a day with the kids running around outside. And I remember this thing called kickball. How many of you remember kickball when you were growing up? To me, it was like that hideous red ball hurled at me at 100 miles per hour as I tried to run out there and boom, and then run bases. Needless to say, nobody really wanted me on their team. It was usually me and the blind kid stuck at the fence every game. Feeling that sense of pain and rejection, I become extra sensitive to the fact that due to having 4 different generations with vastly different attitudes, everybody's going to feel pain and rejection sometime in today's world. Ta-da! Ba-ba-ba! Our environment is changing so rapidly that none of us can really afford to leave anybody at the fence. How many of you are in startups right now? The statistics on startups are this. Back in 1990, for a software startup, you know how much money it took? $30 million. In 1997, that figure was shrunk to $3 million. Last year, it took $25,000 for a software startup. What does that mean? That means entrants to the market are coming in rapidly. That means if you want to succeed, you need all brains on deck. That means you can't leave brains at the fence because you don't understand the way that they think and the way that they behave. So what do? In order to be successful, there are 3 key things I want you to consider today. All of us can choose this and not only be successful in leading across generations, but also be more successful as human beings. We can all choose to recognize our own biases. We can all practice what I call multifocal communication, and we can all learn to think paradoxically. So let me begin. Generational biases. Every one of us has a bias, an attitude, and a behavior that was formed between the age 3 and 11. And those attitudes, habits, and behaviors were formed based on what was going on around us when we were growing up. And they became formative in the way that we interact. In the earliest generation, or the latest generation around now, the traditionalists, many of them were brought into an era with a lot of scarcity. It was the Great Depression, but they had a lot of reverence for authority. In today's organization, do we revere them? They thought because they were the oldest that they would be revered. One of my client companies the other day, I create corporate conversations. So I go into a lot of companies and I help people start communicating together more effectively so that no brains are left behind. One of my clients is a small engineering firm. So we were working on accountability and goals. And on one side of the room, we had the engineers that started engineering back in the 1960s when a computer took up the size of this room. They were called the relics. On the other side of the room, we had the fresh grads whose handheld was the smartest thing in the room. They were called the stem cells. Little bias going on there. But in order for us to recognize that everybody has something to contribute, we need to start understanding where we came from and what formed those biases. Next generation, baby boomers. How many baby boomers do we have in the room? Okay, stand up and be proud. All right, somewhat proud. We've got about a quarter of the room are left, baby boomers. You know what the largest generation is today in the workforce? Millennials. 50% of the workforce are millennials. Okay. Baby boomers now are at the smallest, or one of the smaller generations in the workplace. Gen X is the smallest generation in the workplace. But baby boomers, those of you who are of this generation, you recognize this. We were raised at a time of prosperity. There was a lot of opportunity. There were a lot of great things happening. We became fiercely proud and still patriotic. But the other thing is, we only had 5 television channels to watch. So the information that we got was highly filtered. And remember, duck and cover? How many of you here were raised in a city where you had bomb shelters on every corner? Absolutely. What were we afraid of? We were afraid of the Reds coming over and bombing us. We were paranoid of the communists, weren't we? So even though we were raised with a lot of prosperity, we were also raised to be kind of xenophobic and fear things we didn't know. Recognize these biases form us, but self-awareness and conscious choice can transform us. Next generation, Gen X. Now the lid was busted off. That old reality, which was corporate environment and loyalty, that was blown off. People were being laid off in record numbers. Moms that used to stay at home and take care of their kids now had the kids latchkey, coming in themselves and taking care of themselves. Lock the door. Don't let anybody in. And there's no trust anymore for the corporate man. Why? Because there is no covert loyalty. We started questioning our authority figures with silly things like a Vietnam War. Now we were open to 75 cable channels. We started seeing the reality of the world. That was the world. We didn't know this before. Gen X was the first generation that realized any news media that wasn't fed to them. So yeah, they became skeptical, but they also became highly innovative. Recognizes our biases form us, and awareness and conscious choice can transform us. The generation that comprises the majority of the workforce, the millennials. This generation was raised with hundreds of views. They were raised with information at a glance, one click away. These tech natives were raised being able to grab what they needed anytime that they needed. They didn't want to run it up a flagpole in some company waiting for it to run back down again. They wanted it now. Okay. Now think about some of the biases that we have because of the way we were raised. What are some typical biases that you hear in the workforce around, let's say, millennials? What's one of the typical biases? Say? Detached. That millennials are detached. So interesting. What's another typical bias? Entitled. That's one that comes up very much. We're going to start to question and look at these biases today because you know what else? There's a lot more to the story. One of the things I want to leave you with before we talk about biases and why they're so powerful in us is what it takes to attain the American dream. How many of you in here, raise your hand please, if you entered the workforce before 1990? Okay. There were rules and guidelines entering the workforce pre-1990, and they look something like this. Remember these? You want to do good in the workforce, you keep your head down, you pay your dues, you follow instructions, you show up on time, you do what you're told. I remember paying my dues. I was a psychology student. Paying my dues meant I got to go work in crazy hospitals. I worked in psych hospitals for 5 years. Why? Welcome. Because I was paying my dues. But the great thing about that is now I'm perfectly well equipped to work with corporate executives. So I'm actually happy for the experience. But it was paying my dues. Now, we remember this, and this forms us, and we expect people to come into the corporate environment knowing these same rules and guidelines. But what are the rules and guidelines today? According to Seth Godin, they look a lot more like this. Be remarkable, generate art, make good judgment calls, connect people and ideas. I don't know about you, but if I'm running a company, which attitude, habit, or behavior would I rather have? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yet, those of us that entered the workforce before 1990 are biased, thinking that everybody should take our viewpoint of the world. Biases form us, and awareness can transform us. The last thing I want you to know about biases before we move on. Biases are in a part of the brain that is extremely difficult to change. Biases, according to a neurological lab in Greenwich Village, New York, where they hook up electrodes and they show pictures of things that people have remarked being biased against. The part of the brain that lights up is called the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain. You ever get that feeling like the hair on the back of your neck stands up when you see something that you don't agree with? That's called your amygdala, and it's a fear center. But when we make decisions based on fear, are we creative or are we stifling? Thank you. The other thing that lights up is what's called the basal ganglia. That's where habits are formed. We wonder why diversity training doesn't work. It's because so many of our biases are so deeply ingrained. So what does work? Biases form us, awareness transforms us. Be aware that many of us are formed because of our upbringing and the way that we were raised, but it doesn't mean that we have to stay that way. We have conscious choice as human beings. One of the things I ask my clients to do all the time is if you want to get rid of any bias, reflect for just a moment. What is your bias? And ask yourself this question: what else could be true? So one of the biases against the millennials are what? That they're entitled? So what else could be true? How about they know their worth? How about they already have self-esteem, so we don't need to try to give it to them? What are the biases against the relics in the workforce? Closed-minded. What else could be true? Experienced. We've seen a lot of what's going to fail, but I'll tell you, because their world was very small growing up, their world still can be very small, but you can open it up when you start to ask questions and start to understand their universe. Just because they were raised as a silent generation, they're not going to offer, you need to ask. They were raised in such a time where children were seen but not heard. Don't expect them to be raising their hands in brainstorming sessions. Okay? They want to be approached and asked. And yes, they naturally think people should revere them because of their time on the planet, because that's the way they were raised. So what else could be true? So biases are the first thing to recognize. Second thing I want to talk to you about is how many of you in here lead people today? Raise your hand if you lead people. Okay. The more you can understand the invisible forces that shape us, the better you will be at leading people. The invisible forces that shape us are very often our generational biases. They are formed between age 3 and 11. and they are strengthened in adolescent years. Those are things that form us. But when we become aware of other options, it can transform us. But please learn and recognize. I've got handouts that I'll throw out to the audience here afterwards because I failed to do that before. And it'll give you a good snapshot for different ways that each generation views things. But that's just simply a bias. It doesn't mean that everybody, just because you were born in a generation, you don't have to belong to that template. People are unique. Get to know them as individuals, and you'll recognize that. Communication is the number one issue that my clients come to me with. Number one issue, no matter what size company, no matter what size team, we all need to learn to communicate better. How many of you have challenges in communication on a daily basis? Whether maybe it's with your spouse or with a coworker, raise your hand if you're challenged by communication. We all are, okay? Oh, you might be challenged by the truth if you're not raising your hand right now, because we're all challenged by communication. It's a very difficult thing. If you want to influence across all generations, you want to get all brains on deck, you want to be able to do things faster, then learn to practice multifocal communication. Learn to over-communicate. I like to pictorially represent it like this. Information goes in and get it out in a number of different fashions. Some people like texts more than phone calls. Some people like email. Some people like I am. I've got a friend of mine that says, his answering machine says, you're never going to get a phone call back if you choose to leave a message. Facebook me, and you can get a hold of me. Learn people's methods and practice multifocal communication. It's the best way to learn to communicate across generations. Millennials enjoy group mentoring, not one-on-one mentoring. Okay? So learn to speak in sound bites and then stop. Pause. Most of the time we get rolling and rolling and rolling with our message because we think it's so important. We start talking at words 400, 500, 600 words per minute when people can only comprehend 250. Use a sound bite and pause. Let people comprehend what you're saying if you really want to get through to them. Okay? Tell good stories. Everybody responds to stories. Stories transfer any generation. That's one of the reasons why the relics are so much fun. They've got really entertaining stories. And in that story, they develop rapport and relationship. And once they've got rapport and relationship, they start to open up. And they are carrying years of experience that's useful in solving big, hairy problems. Practice multifocal communication. Structured brainstorming. How many of you use brainstorming in here? It's a wonderful habit, right? Structured brainstorming is this. People write down their ideas first, and then you go around the room one at a time and ask for them. Some people respond in big groups, other people don't. The number one thing you can have in any conversation, communication, or leadership is the good question. When you can learn to ask really good questions, then you can learn to influence people. Why? What do questions do? They cause people to think. And if you ask a really good question, people begin to think. And once they begin to think, you begin to engage their brains. And right now in this rapidly moving environment, we need all brains on deck. It's estimated that by the end of this decade, 100 of the Fortune 500 companies will no longer be on the list. They'll be replaced by companies that don't even exist yet today. If you want one of your companies to be one of those companies, learn to recognize biases, practice multifocal communication, and the last thing I'd like to share with you today is this. Learn to think paradoxically. What's a paradox? Contradictions in the mind, jumbo shrimp, right? Paradox, deeply superficial person, paradox, okay? How about this one of my favorite? You'd be surprised at how much it costs to look cheap, paradox. If you can entertain two options in your mind at the same time, you can think in paradox. When I worked with Michael Dell and his executive team back in the early 80s, or 90s, Michael and I would argue all the time. He wanted highly intelligent executives. I said you need emotionally strong executives because only a high EQ can develop people. So what did we do? We got people that were smart with EQ. A paradox is entertaining two opposing views at the same time. and being able to toss them back and forth in your mind. It's not either or. It's not stem cell or it's not relic. It's both and. Charles Duhigg wrote a book in 2013 called The Power of Habit. He won a Pulitzer Prize for that book. He recently finished his next book on how to be the most influential and productive human being. One of his key points is being able to hold opposing viewpoints in your mind without having to support either one or the other. These are some of our paradoxical leaders of our time. The leaders with the hyphens that take their business model, like Elon Musk and Richard Branson, they take their business models and they keep expanding, expanding, expanding. They look for similarities and not for differences. Okay. Padmasree Warrior, former CTO for Cisco Systems. Now she's the CEO for the Chinese car company NextTN. She spends all week long solving big, hairy business problems and all weekend long playing with art, mosaics, yoga, and massage. Why? So she can be a paradoxical leader. The choice is yours. Our biases form us, self-awareness and conscious choice transform us. I want you today to please take away, if nothing else, this. When you recognize your biases, then you can find out what you all have in common. As a young child, I knew I would never be good at team sports, but you know what I could do? From the sidelines, I could look up from this, and I could smile, and I could cheer. And my enthusiasm started to define me as an individual. Guess what transfers across all generations? Thank you. Could I have more time? Questions? Nobody else is here? I'll take it. Who's got questions? Anyone? Thoughts, questions, attitudes, behaviors? No, she's telling me no, I can't. I've got a mic. You can't stop me now. All right.
You
Thank
saw
you
us
so
standing
much.
over there.
Thank you so much, Teri.